signed up for a certain course. He attended the first lecture session, and thereafter cut every session of the class. When the end of the semester came, nevertheless, he took the final examination, and to the surprise of the instructor, he received a grade of 98%. This abashed the professor. It was a blow to his pride. So he called the young man into the office and said, "Now look here, how is it possible for you to sign up for this course, attend only the first lecture, cut every other lecture in the course, and at the end of the semester receive a grade of 98% on your examination?" "Well," said the young man apologetically, "I think I could have made 100%, but you confused me in that first lecture." In these times together, we have been considering some of the theological dimensions of the Old Testament that are basic to the New Testament gospel and which even supplement and enrich the Christian proclamation. You will recall that we began with the theme of story or history, in German the single word Geschichte. That is, the basic narrative mode for the expression of faith in God, as evident in much of the literature of the Old Testament, and which is reducible to ascriptions of praise to God who is actively involved in our world, the God who created heavens and earth, the God who brought his people out of the house of bondage, the God who gave his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or the God who raised Jesus Christ from the dead. The uniqueness of the biblical drama, we have been saying, is that God is the main actor in the human story. God gets into our world, so to speak, introduces God's self personally and relationally, and becomes involved with his people through acts of judgment and mercy. Now, human beings are not just passive bystanders in this great drama that reaches its climax in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. People play a role, too. And this is not only true of the original human actors in the story, Abraham and Sarah, Moses and Miriam, Jeremiah and Hananiah, Peter and Mary, and a host of others. It's also true of us who read the Scripture today. As Amos Wilder puts it, you remember, the stories of the Bible and the overall story of which they are episodic parts have the power, through the activity of the Holy Spirit, to relate us to the great dramatist and storyteller, God himself. The question is, what kind of role do human actors play in the God story? Well, much of the time it's a role of resistance, opposition, foot-dragging. That's the burden of the prophetic indictments of Israel. That's the testimony of the great Psalms of penitence in the Psalter, such as the great Psalm 51. That's the witness of Israel's storytellers who portrayed the wilderness as a time of murmuring and rebellion. And that's the witness of Israel's historians, for instance, the Deuteronomistic historian, who in retrospect saw the entire history with Yahweh as a history of failure on the part of the people. Therefore, it's appropriate for the people of God, even yet, to confess their sin as one of the beginning acts of worship, as in the prayer of general confession. "We have erred and strayed from thy ways like lost sheep. We have followed too much the devices and desires of our own hearts, and there is no health, there is no wholeness in us." Tonight, however, I am concerned with another way of being related to the great dramatist, namely asking questions of God in faith. In the English language, we have a $64 word for this, though in this time of inflation, the cash value would have to be raised considerably. In the United States to at least $400 and maybe more than $400 here in Canada, I don't know. But at any rate, that word, that value word, is the word expostulation. According to the dictionary, this word means, and I quote, to reason with a person earnestly, objecting to his or her actions or intentions, to remonstrate with. Next time you have an argument with your wife or your husband or friend, maybe you should say, we weren't really arguing, we were just expostulating. Anyway, the Bible is replete with literature of expostulation, literature in which people dare to question God's ways, boldly cry out in bafflement or protest in an honest-to-God fashion. Strangely, the New Testament does not contain expostulations with God. And I'm not altogether sure what the explanation for this lack is. The major exception, of course, is Jesus' cry of dereliction from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? But that, of course, is a quotation of the opening words of the great Psalm of Lament, Psalm 22. Perhaps early Christians were so convinced that the end of the ages, the consummation of God's purpose, had come upon them, and that the grand consummation was so near that they had no time for such questions. In any case, expostulatory literature emerged in the period after the closing of the Christian canon. Think of Augustine's Confessions. Think of Luther's passionate outcries in the time of Anfechtung, or trial of faith. Think of John Donne's Expostulations. And we surely live in the kind of a world where many people feel like crying out to God in questioning or in protest in the face of perplexing events, like the assassination of Anwar Sadat, the gloomy daily news about the escalation of violence, some tragedy that engulfs a person in the prime of life, for instance, terminal cancer, or some social injustice that crushes a minority people. The cry, my God, why, is not only a modern question, but it is a scriptural question. And the church may well discover that one of the ways that the Old Testament speaks to us today is through literature of expostulation. Now, before letting some of the great expostulators of Scripture speak to us, it's important to make one thing very clear at the outset. Expostulation with God found in the Old Testament is in every case based on trust in God. Without exception, questions to God are raised in faith, the kind of faith that seeks understanding. Hence, it's necessary for us to say something about the faith that dares to raise questions to God. For this faith, this biblical faith, expresses a particular kind of relationship between God and human beings, a particular kind of belief about God's character and God's relation to the creation. One way to approach this fundamental matter is to compare Israel's literature of expostulation with other literature in which human beings find themselves caught in suffering and tragedy. Recently, I read with great interest an essay that appeared on the subject Expostulation with the Divine, a note on contrasting attitudes in Greek and Hebrew piety. It's written by an author, Milo Kaufman, and appeared some years ago in the magazine called Interpretation. This author begins the essay with the observation, the Greeks, by and large, did not expostulate with the divine. The Hebrews did. And he goes on to say here in the first paragraph, Oedipus confronts his fate with horror, but he does not dispute with Apollo or Zeus. Orestes in the Eumenides resolutely denies that he is a lowly supplicant before the Furies or Athene. He has done what Apollo commanded by way of sacrificial expiation. and he wishes neither to argue with the Furies nor to beg further favors from the gods. His case rests. But in Hebrew tradition, says this writer, expostulation with the divine is characteristic. Particularly, this author is interested in comparing Job agonistes. Agonistes is a Greek word which goes back to the athletic contest, refers to a combatant, a wrestler. He's particularly interested in comparing Job agonistes with Oedipus agonistes on the one hand, and in comparing Moses on Mount Sinai with Orestes in Athens. In both cases of comparison, the persons have to wrestle with a situation that's given to them. It's given. The Greek heroes, so this author argues, wrestled with the ambiguities of their trial without any expostulation or argument. The Hebrews, on the other hand, speak up and raise questions vehemently, or, as the dictionary definition of expostulation puts it, they reason with God earnestly, objecting to his actions or intentions. Well, as you perhaps know, in Greek culture, fate, Moira, was a power greater than men and gods. To be sure, a tragic hero could assert himself in hubris, that is, wanton violence arising from pride of strength and passion and so forth, could assert himself in hubris, even inadvertently, but he could not escape nemesis, that is, retribution that levels all things to their proper and assigned place. The drama Oedipus Rex is a powerful exposition of this, and I can assume that you all know that Greek tragedy. Yet the human dramas of the Old Testament belong in an entirely different world. In this sphere of belief, this biblical sphere of belief, God, not fate, is entirely in control. Yahweh, who is disclosed to the people as personal will, is supremely trustworthy and therefore worthy of human worship. Yahweh's will is not the cold, inescapable, impersonal determination of fate, but rather the beneficent and benevolent guidance of providence. Yahweh is not bound by any power of fate or necessity outside of himself, but is free, as the Scripture puts it, to be gracious unto whom he will be gracious, and to have mercy upon whom he will have mercy. Yahweh is preeminently the God of Hesed, that rich Hebrew word which the Revised Standard Version translates as steadfast love. Yahweh is the God of Hesed. Yahweh is the faithful God, and therefore the God who can be argued with. A moment ago I alluded to a passage in the book of Exodus, actually to the 33rd chapter of Exodus. The context there is the story of the making of the golden calf, chapter 32, and the remaking of the covenant on the basis of divine grace and forgiveness, chapter 34. Perhaps you remember the story. The people grew impatient during Moses' long absence on the top of Mount Sinai. Like most people today, they wanted a God that was close at hand, a familiar God that was part of their world. And so we are told they made a god for themselves in the form of a calf, a well-known symbol for the divine in ancient culture. In this project, they had the help of a clergyman, the Reverend Mr. Aaron. And this whole project raised the question, so the narrator tells us, as to whether Yahweh, the holy God, could possibly be with and go with a people of this sort, so fickle, so stubborn in their ways, so blind in heart, so worldly. Moses, as a covenant mediator, interceded for the people, using his own arguments to implore Yahweh to change his course of action. Finally, he pleaded for Yahweh to show him his ways. We are now in the 33rd chapter of the book of Exodus. That is, the manner of his dealings with people. And the narrator goes on to say that Yahweh gave Moses a special theophany, a special manifestation of divine glory. Moses, so the story goes, was hidden in the cleft of a rock, a cave, and Yahweh passed by, though only allowing Moses to see him en passant, that is to see only his back, or, as it were, his derriere, so the Scripture says. And the story continues in chapter 34, where Yahweh proclaims his own identity as signified in the name Yahweh. Listen to the scriptural text in Exodus 34. Then Yahweh passed by before him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and full of hesed and faithfulness, extending hesed to thousands, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin, but who will definitely not exempt from punishment, visiting the sins of the ancestors upon the children, to children's children, unto the third and fourth generation. That is, to an extended family. A family unto the third and fourth generations, under one household. This vivid story intends to show that the God of Israel is the holy God, who cannot be reduced to human measurement or domesticated within the human world. But this holy God is not characterized by capricious, blind, numinous power, but rather power that has a personal face or personal presence, and above all, power that is characterized by faithfulness, even though people are not excused or exempted from the consequences of their deeds. This is the passage that is picked up from Exodus 33 and 34 in the beautiful 103rd Psalm, which begins also with the exclamation, bless or adore Yahweh, O my being. We read in Psalm 103 that Yahweh works vindication and justice for all who are oppressed. He made known his ways to Moses, his acts to the people of Israel. Yahweh is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. Now perhaps we are in a position to understand Moses' agonistes, or Job agonistes. The agonistic faith, that is to say, the faith that wrestles, is based on confidence in God's faithfulness, in God's being true to his word, in God's constancy in the face of all of the ups and downs that human beings may experience. That's the way it is in the Psalms of Lament, which comprise 1/3 of all of the Psalms of the Psalter. And here I'm thinking of a sermon that alumni of this institution heard the other evening from Dr. Judson Levy. In Psalm 22, for instance, a psalmist boldly raises a question out of the depths of his life, my God, why have you forsaken me? This question, however, is raised in faith. The faith that even in times of the apparent absence of God seeks understanding, and hence the psalmist immediately bursts out into an expression of confidence in Yahweh's faithfulness. Nevertheless, note how there's an adversity there after that cry of dereliction. Nevertheless, you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our ancestors trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried, and were saved. In you they trusted, and were not disappointed. His continuing description of distress is interspersed with further expressions of trust, such as, upon you I was cast from my birth, and since my mother bore me, you have been my God. And finally, his passionate petition, but you, O Yahweh, don't be far off. O you who are my help, hasten to my aid, is based on the confidence that the God who is now hidden or temporarily eclipsed will once again show his face. And accordingly, the lament ends with a resolve to praise Yahweh in the believing and worshiping community. That's Psalm 22. The expostulations found in the Old Testament are like the laments of the Psalter in that they show an ability to be honest to God in times of distress. We may add that this honesty, this freedom to protest to God, even in prayer, may have a therapeutic power in times of suffering and bereavement. And it is worth noting that my new colleague, Professor Donald Capps, in the field of pastoral counseling, adduces the laments of the Psalter as a major model for pastoral counseling. That appears in his recent book called Pastoral Counseling and Preaching. However, the expostulations of the Old Testament differ from the laments of the Psalter in that they demonstrate a dimension of argument, of vehement demand, of faith insisting upon having understanding. Well, we can't deal adequately tonight with all of the great expostulations in the Old Testament. Let's take up just a few and see if there's any trend in the expostulations with God. I'm going to consider briefly Abraham, Moses, Habakkuk, and Job. Our earliest instance of expostulation with God is found near the beginning of the Bible, and the expostulator is none other than Abraham, whom tradition remembers as a man of great faith. Indeed, the Epistle to the Hebrews remembers him in the roll call of the faithful as a man of tremendous faith. And that's not only true of Abraham, according to the Epistle to the Hebrews, it's likewise true of Sarah, who is portrayed as a faithful person as well. Abraham and Sarah together made a great venture of faith, breaking their ties with the past in Babylonia and moving into an unknown, uncertain future, trusting in the divine promises, even when all the evidence, humanly speaking, was against the fulfillment of those promises. In the immediate context, and now we find ourselves in the 18th chapter of the book of Genesis, Sarah played an important role. The story goes that when she was entertaining angels unaware, she overheard a promise. She was inside the tent, and she overheard a promise about a child. A promise so fantastic, when measured against everyday reality, for she was well past the time of childbearing and the sexual pleasure of youth. She was well past all of those human possibilities, and therefore she broke out into laughter. That's one kind of humor, of course. It's based on the grotesque disproportion between what is said and what is real. And I think, as an illustration of this, of Dr. Lovesey's marvelous joke that he told the other night about Vatican III and Vatican IV. If you didn't hear that story, you ought to press him or someone to tell it to you, because it's a very good illustration of the kind of humor that I am talking about. Here, however, laughter points up the fundamental absurdity of faith. That is to say, the discrepancy between what God has promised, God's Word, and the possibilities in the human situation. The author of the Epistle to the Hebrews, who dwells on Sarah's role more than does the narrator in Genesis 18, puts it nicely. Sarah considered him, Yahweh, God, faithful, who had promised. In the Genesis narrative, however, the spotlight falls on Abraham after the angelic visitors have left. The narrator wants the reader to understand that both Abraham and Sarah are caught up in the future promises of God, and that for this reason Abraham is entitled to know what God is about to do, you might say, in the realm of foreign policy. The corruption of Sodom and Gomorrah was great. The sin of the people was grave, so much so that Yahweh had to act. His actions, however, were not capricious, but consonant with the faithfulness that he had shown to the people of Abraham that were special in his sight. So the plan to blot out Sodom and Gomorrah in a great Holocaust should not be withheld from Abraham, a man of faith who trusted in the faithfulness of God. This is the theological basis of Abraham's expostulation with God that follows that episode. Abraham's argument with God starts with a rhetorical question. Shall not the shofet, that's the word for judge, shall not the shofet of the whole earth do mishpat? That's the word for justice. Of course, God has the power to act as he will, and his actions are not subject to human veto. But when a whole city, like Sodom and Gomorrah, is completely corrupt and depraved, even according to human standards, to say nothing of God's penetrating insight, there is nothing to prevent God from acting in his own way and in his own time. But Abraham is troubled. And he ventures to expostulate with Yahweh in a very courteous and diplomatic fashion. A Holocaust that wipes out the cities of the Jordan Plain is a terrible thing. We know the meaning of the word Holocaust, which is based on a Greek compound, burnt whole, Holocaust. We know that in our experience. The Holocaust that burned up Hiroshima and Nagasaki in a nuclear blast. The Holocaust that exterminated around 6 million Jews in Nazi ovens. How can Yahweh, whose ways are faithful and who acts to execute justice on the earth, carry out a Holocaust of Sodom and Gomorrah which might immolate innocent and righteous persons? So Abraham presses his argument here in the 18th chapter of Genesis very gently, very diplomatically. Suppose, he says, there are 50 righteous people in the city. Won't you spare the city for the sake of the 50? And Yahweh relents. For his will is not a predetermined fate, Moira. And then Abraham presses his question further, very politely. Suppose there are 50 lacking 5. Won't you spare the city for the sake of 45? And again, a divine concession. And the expostulation continues diplomatically but firmly. 40, 30, 20. And fearing that he's taxing God's patience, Abraham presses the question just once more. Oh, let not Yahweh be angry, and I will speak again but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. And the answer came, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. At this point, the expostulation breaks off abruptly. The story ends with the laconic words, Yahweh went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. Abraham's question remains unanswered. Will not the shofet of the whole earth do mishpat? The assumption is that Yahweh does not act capriciously. The arbiter of providence is trustworthy. Nevertheless, the Holocaust occurred, with only Lot and his family escaping. Archaeologists tell us that the cities of the once fertile Jordan Plain, situated on a geological fault, were destroyed in a seismic upheaval that changed the contours of the Dead Sea area. The biblical narrative, however, attributes the catastrophe not to natural forces, but to Yahweh's action. Listen, Genesis 19. Then Yahweh rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from Yahweh out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. When Abraham rose early in the morning, so the story goes, and went to the place where he had had his expostulation with Yahweh, he saw the Holocaust. The Scripture says he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the Jordan Valley, and lo, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. You could almost see a vision, as it were, of a mushroom cloud. We may note at this point that a huge theological price has to be paid for monotheism, for the belief in one God. In polytheistic religions of antiquity, such an event could have been explained on the basis of the caprice of the gods, or by saying that some malevolent deity had carried out the Holocaust and a benevolent deity had snatched Lot and his family like brands from the burning. But the biblical narrative stands on firm theological ground. Yahweh alone is the judge of the whole earth. And Yahweh is faithful and just in all his ways. So let's turn from Abraham to Moses, our second expostulator. Moses is portrayed as the mediator of the covenant between God and Israel. In the old epic tradition, Moses is portrayed as an agonistic, a wrestling man of faith who struggled with Yahweh at the time of his call and commission, the story of the burning bush, you remember, and who later dared to argue with Yahweh as he offered his intercession for the people on Mount Sinai. We've already found ourselves in this narrative context, the story of the golden calf and its sequel, so we know that Moses' boldness in prayer is based on the theological premise of Yahweh's faithfulness, Yahweh's chesed. It's astounding, however, to find at the heart of the Torah story the covenant mediator expostulating with God on behalf of the people and even willing to offer himself as a sacrifice for them. According to the story, Yahweh knew about the covenant betrayal evident in the worship of the calf even before Moses learned of it. And Yahweh said to Moses, so the story goes, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now, therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. But of you, Moses, I will make a great nation. So the plan, according to Exodus 32, was to annihilate the people and to start all over from one person. But Moses objects, and he objects vehemently. Surely, he says, divine holiness is not a wrathful power that consumes. He even tries an argument that Ezekiel emphasized centuries later. Spare the people for the sake of your divine honor. For why should the Egyptians be allowed to say that Yahweh delivered a people from oppression only to capriciously change his mind and consume them from the face of the earth out there in the wilderness? And then he makes another appeal in his expostulation. He appeals to the promises made to the ancestors, promises that were grounded solely in Yahweh's grace. Listen to the passage in Exodus 32. Moses prays, intercedes, turn away from your fierce wrath and relent from this evil against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, that is Jacob, your servants, to whom you made an oath by your own self. So the appeal to Yahweh's fidelity to his own promise clinched the argument. It clinched the expostulation. We read in the story, Yahweh repented. The verb nicham in the nifal. Yahweh repented of the evil, the disaster that he intended to do to his people. Well, the impact of this narrative is almost staggering. The very idea that a man, even a man in the unique role of a covenant mediator, should come before God and argue vehemently that God turned from a course of action that brings disaster, evil, ra'ah in the Hebrew, upon this people. It would be possible for us at this point to move out into a discussion of the efficacy of prayer. There are too many people who suppose that prayer is merely a subjective exercise and that prayer is not efficacious. But the assumption of the biblical faith is that God is involved with the people and that God is flexible in his actions and therefore responsive to people's prayers. God is not bound inflexibly by a course of action, by some fate or necessity, but rather being consistent with his own purpose, being faithful, basically. Nevertheless, God can change, God can repent, God can relent, and therefore there will be a new possibility for the future. Well, perhaps we've spent long enough on this particular passage in the book of Exodus. I should have gone further into a similar passage in the book of Numbers, chapter 14, where once again, boldly, Moses appeals to Yahweh's honor and gracious ways when it seemed that the people's folly would shut the door on a future in the promised land. Here, too, the premise is the faithfulness of God, and therefore the liturgical summary found in Exodus 34 is once again quoted in that context in Numbers 14, namely, Yahweh is slow to anger and abounding in chesed, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty. We turn now to our third expostulator, to the prophet Habakkuk. Questioning God's ways in the world was taken up again and again in the history of Israel's traditions, especially on the eve of the fall of Jerusalem in 587 B.C. and the exile of the people from their homeland. If we were to treat this chapter of Israel's life story adequately, we would have to concentrate our attention on the prophet Jeremiah, the prophet like unto Moses, who boldly entered into dialogue with Yahweh. Jeremiah's Mosaic boldness in arguing with Yahweh is evident in the story of his call and commission in the first chapter, an account which has striking similarities with the account of Moses' call in the third chapter of Exodus. And of course, Jeremiah's passionate pleadings become especially insistent and vehement in the so-called confessions, those little poems in the book of Jeremiah in which the prophet daringly initiated a covenant lawsuit, a reeve, against Yahweh. Imagine that. A prophet of God calling Yahweh to trial and putting searching questions to him about his administration of human affairs. Much more could be said about Jeremiah agonistes, but for lack of time, let us turn our attention primarily to Jeremiah's contemporary, the prophet Habakkuk, who boldly expostulated with God about the terrible avalanche of evil that was sweeping over the world in his time, sweeping away the innocent and the guilty alike in a flood of blood. Habakkuk's expostulations with Yahweh take place in two cycles or two turns of the dialogue. In the first, the prophet speaks, and in the second, Yahweh answers, and that speech and answer is twice repeated. Formally, this dialogic structure found in the first and the early part of the first chapter and the early part of the second of the book of Habakkuk, formally, it is like the Psalms of Lament, in which a suppliant raises a cry out of the depths, and then, at least implicitly, Yahweh answers, or at least the assurance is given that Yahweh has heard the suppliant's prayer, with the result that the whole mood of the psalm changes and the suppliant announces his intention to praise Yahweh in the worshiping congregation. The prophet Habakkuk begins by raising a lament, using the cry that echoes throughout the laments of the Psalter, "O Yahweh, how long?" We hear it also in the last book of the New Testament, the Apocalypse of John. Habakkuk's outcry is prompted by violence, the Hebrew word chamas, the very word which is found in the introduction to the flood story, and a word with which we are all too familiar in our own time. Listen to the prophet's outcry. "How long, Yahweh, shall I cry for help, and you will not listen? Shall I cry to you violence, and you will not deliver? Why do you make me see evil? Make me look upon trouble. Destruction and violence are at hand. Controversy and contention arise. Therefore Torah," law in its broad sense, Torah is feeble, and justice does not achieve its end. Hence the wicked gang up around the righteous, and on account of this, justice is miscarried. This part of the dialogue sounds very much like a protest against the violence within a particular society, the kind of disorder that can tear any nation apart. And certainly in my country, the United States, we are all too familiar with that violence, and Perhaps there will be much more in the future. But the poetry here in Habakkuk, at least in its final form, perceives the violence not only on a social scale, but on an international scale. Colossal military power that sweeps like an erupting lava across the world. Yahweh's answer in the next part of the poem is intended to assure the prophet that Yahweh is firmly in control despite the evidences to the contrary. The divine answer is given in the theological perspective of previous prophets like Isaiah of Jerusalem, namely, Yahweh is performing his opus alienum, his strange work, Isaiah 28:21. In this instance, by using the Chaldeans or the Neo-Babylonian Empire as his chosen instrument, as the rod of his anger and the staff of his indignation. The time, therefore, of this prophecy is somewhere around the Battle of Carchemish in the year 605 B.C., when the Neo-Babylonians made their successful bid for world power. Yahweh's use of this brutal instrument of power is admittedly surprising. Indeed, it is shocking. Through the prophet, Yahweh speaks to the distress and the apprehension of the people. Look among the nations and see. Be astounded and surprised, for I'm doing a work in your days you would not believe it if you were told. In Acts 13, verse 41, this prophetic word is quoted to show the surprising thing that God has done in Jesus Christ by raising Jesus from the dead and liberating people from the bondage of sin. But here, in the context of Habakkuk, the oracle announces that Yahweh is on the verge of raising up the Chaldeans. That's the surprise. Here's the description: that nation furious and swift, who march through the earth to seize territory that is not their own. They are dread and terrible. Their justice comes only from themselves. They come swiftly and savagely like predatory beasts, and, so the text says, they come only for violence, in a storm that sweeps by like a hurricane. No fortress can stand against them. No king can stop them. These people, as the text says, at least in the Revised Standard Version translation, these people who have made power their own God. You would almost think that the reference were to men in the Pentagon or the Politburo. You can see how this divine answer stands squarely in the tradition of prophetic preaching from Amos on. For we have found, have we not, that the prophets perceived only one source of evil, that is, the will of the people. They took the people to task, especially the leaders who were responsible for public policy and had access to power, for violating the will of God. That's the kind of violence the prophets denounced as they perceived the social injustices of their time. And furthermore, the prophets proclaimed that Yahweh was about to discipline or chastise the people for their failure to assume covenant responsibility, that he was even using the great foreign powers as his chosen instrument to bring judgment upon the people. You would think that Habakkuk, who stood in this prophetic succession, would have been satisfied with Yahweh's answer. Yahweh's answer that was intended to assure the people in a time of suffering that God was in control of the world powers. But the prophet's lament, the prophet's expostulation continues. He can agree with the message proclaimed by all the prophets, namely, that the disasters of history are Yahweh's discipline. Listen to Habakkuk. Yahweh, you have ordained them, that is, the Chaldeans, for judgment. O rock, that's a divine title, O rock, you have appointed them for chastisement. Yes, but does the punishment fit the crime? That's Habakkuk's problem. He boldly questions Yahweh. O you whose eyes are too pure to look upon evil, and who cannot countenance wrong, why do you countenance the treachery of the wicked? Why keep silent when they devour men more righteous than they? And the prophet presses his expostulatory why as he compares human beings to the fish of the sea that are trapped in nets by fishermen, these fishermen who then proceed to make merry and rejoice indifferently. We can understand Habakkuk's questions very well in our time, can we not? Just read Professor Emil Fackenheim's book, to which I've already referred, God's Presence in History, a book written in the shadow of the Holocaust of 6 million European Jews. If we are to affirm the presence of God in history, and that is the root experience of Israelite tradition, as Professor Fackenheim observes, then the doctrine that suffering is deserved punishment for sin is inadequate in the face of the sufferings and the evils of the world. The novels of Elia Wiesel, for instance, the great novel Night, lead us into the depth of the human question in the face of colossal evil, and thus to Habakkuk's expostulation with God. So we turn to the divine answer to Habakkuk's second lament. The answer comes to one who takes his stand in faith, a posture here symbolized by a tower, which one climbs to watch for signs of activity. We are now at the beginning of the second chapter of the book of Habakkuk. Says the prophet, I will stand at my post. I will take up my position on the watchtower. I will watch to learn what he, Yahweh, will say through me, and what I shall reply when I am challenged. The translation of the New English Bible. And what is the divine answer? Well, the answer is wait. That seems to be the meaning of the command to write the vision on the tablets, for wait. Inscription on tablets is an appeal to a future time, perhaps a future generation, when the words will be understood more clearly and God's ways will become plain. Yahweh said to me, here is the word of Habakkuk, write the vision, record it carefully on tablets, so that he who reads it may run. For still the vision is for the appointed time. It hastens to the end, and it will not deceive. If it tarries, wait for it, for it will surely come. It will not delay. The main thing to know is that Yahweh is faithful. God's word will not fail. God's purpose will not be defeated. Even though in the present it's hard to understand the ways of God, nevertheless God is in control, and in his own time and in his own way he will triumph. In the meantime. And that meantime is the interim between promise and fulfillment, perhaps the interim of our human existence. In the meantime, the righteous person lives faithfully, casting himself or herself on the faithfulness of God. As for the reckless person, if that's the meaning of the Hebrew word at this point, as for the reckless person, he will not be steady. As the New English Bible translates, the reckless will be unsure of himself. But the righteous person will live by his or her faith. That is, by being faithful to God in times of testing and uncertainty. Paul picked up this prophetic word, as we all know, in Romans and Galatians, and he reinterpreted it without distorting the original meaning, for Paul too proclaimed the faithfulness of God to his promises and the relation of the faithful person to God, whose grace gives life now and hope for the future. Well, let us turn abruptly from Habakkuk to our final expostulator, Job. We must turn to Job all too briefly, that titanic figure who dared to hurl his questions and protests to the Almighty. Brevity in our discussion of Job, while not justifiable, may be nevertheless condoned. For most people know the book of Job. They know something about Job's struggle with theodicy, that is, the righteousness of God's ways. Perhaps one thing that needs to be taken more seriously, if not learned for the first time, is that there is a difference between the Job of the prologue and the epilogue, the prose sections of the book of Job. There's quite a difference between the Job of the narrative prose portions and the Job of the poetry. The author of this piece of wisdom literature has used an old folk tale composed in prose as a framing device for his poetry. This is a literary stratagem, a literary convention. The Job of the folk tale, the old Job, is a very pious, patient man who, despite all the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, says calmly, Yahweh has given, Yahweh has taken away, blessed be the name of Yahweh. We know, however, that this kind of Joban patience is very difficult to maintain in the face of the terrible experiences of life. I think of experiences that have come to my attention just recently. Terminal cancer that strikes a productive teacher in his mid-40s. Multiple sclerosis that attacks a young Christian man when life is full of promise and puts him in a cripple's wheelchair. A freak accident that crushes a man at work. And a child that accidentally falls into a well and cannot be rescued. What pastoral counselor would venture to pronounce those words of the patient Job in times of stark tragedy? Yahweh has given, Yahweh has taken away, blessed be the name of Yahweh. Moreover, the Job of the folk tale, the prose prologue and the prose epilogue, is one who not only suffers patiently, but who in the end receives everything back in more than good measure. The books are balanced in this life, and in good Hollywood movie style, at least the style of former years, everyone lives happily ever after. We are concerned tonight with the Job portrayed by the poet who used this old folk tale to frame Job's expostulations with God. We are interested in the Job who opened with a lament in which he cursed the day of his birth, chapter 3. The Job who passionately argued his innocence with his three friends and wished that he might argue his case directly with God, chapters 4 through 27. The Job who steadfastly maintained his relative righteousness throughout the dialogue and eventually issued a long protestation of innocence, chapters 29 through 31. The Job who was finally cowed into submission by God's overwhelming display of cosmic power, chapters 38 through 42. Remember that the divine answer to Habakkuk's expostulation was, wait, just wait. In God's good time, everything will be clear. But Job cannot be satisfied personally and existentially with postponement. He is too aware that human life is limited. It's not accidental that Job begins by lamenting the day of his birth. And throughout his reflections, he's haunted by the shadow of death. Birth and death. These are the given limitations of our existence over which we have no control. For we did not choose to be born, and we have no choice about the day of our death. Within these temporal limitations, birth and death, the question is whether there is an ultimate meaning or purpose that sanctifies birth and glorifies death. Whether there is an ultimate meaning or whether, as in Hemingway's wonderful short story, A Clean, Bright Place, we are confronted with nothing. Nada in Spanish. Remember how he ends with that parody on the Lord's Prayer. Our nada, who art in nada, nada be thy name. What is the meaning of life in this brief interim which we all share between birth and death? For a moment, Job plays with the hope that after death he will have a vindicator who will get justice for him, a Goel, a redeemer who will justify him. Remember that marvelous passage, I know that my Redeemer lives, but he relinquishes that hope almost the moment it comes to him, for he's not really concerned with a post-mortem solution to injustice that has to be suffered now. What really troubles him in the precarious interim between birth and death is that suffering is out of all proportion to any wrong that he's done. Not that he's a paragon of virtue. After all, he's a mortal man, weak and fallible, and therefore deserving of some degree of divine discipline and correction. But the problem is that the punishment does not fit the crime. Further, what is the crime that he has committed that warrants such a heavy weight of punishment? And finally, where is the judge? And where is the jury before whom he can plead his case saying, not guilty? He's like Joseph K. in Kafka's novel, The Trial, who wonders whether there's anyone in the castle or any way to reach his accuser. Listen to Job. I quote from the 23rd chapter. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, he would give heed to me. There an upright man could reason with him, and I should be acquitted forever by my judge. Like Habakkuk, Job received a divine answer to his expostulations. But was the answer out of the whirlwind really an answer? Strangely, God does not even speak to the questions that Job raised, but instead called attention to his marvelous control of the cosmos, exceeding all human understanding. Job was even rebuked for questioning God, when in reality God is the one who should put the questions. I will question you, and you shall declare to me, said Yahweh, as though to say that God, the Creator, is completely outside our human world, completely beyond our categories of thought, and therefore any human attempt to fathom or explore the ways of God, and therefore to come up with a philosophical theodicy, is the height of presumption. So Job repented, not once, but twice. And we wonder why. Did he cave in before God's display of cosmic power? Did he surrender his human integrity when confronted by questions that reached beyond the human ken? That's a big question for the exegesis of Job. I think not, myself. Rather, Job realized in the end, more existentially than he'd ever known in earlier day of untroubled faith and easy answers, that at the heart of the mystery that enfolds the cosmos, the mystery which enfolds our lives from birth to death, is the Creator who cares. The Creator whose faithfulness completely defies human comprehension, and in this sense, whose ways are higher than our ways and whose thoughts transcend our thoughts, to quote the language of the prophet 2nd Isaiah. Samuel Terrien's annotation to the text of the Revised Standard Version, I think, is to the point. Dr. Terrien of Union Theological Seminary, who's written a great book on the book of Job, writes, God has not vindicated Job, but he has come to him personally. The upholder of the universe cares for a lonely man so deeply that he offers him the fullness of his communion. Now, in conclusion, let's try to summarize the trend of these expostulations, which extend through the Old Testament period and which are associated preeminently with men of great faith: Abraham, Moses, Jeremiah, Habakkuk, Job. We began, you will remember, by recognizing that this literature of questioning and even protest is one of the distinctive traditions of the Old Testament. And though not found within the New Testament, except for the instance of Jesus' cry of dereliction from the cross, surfaces from time to time in the great writings of the Christian tradition. What can we say about the theology of expostulation? First, it has to be said emphatically that expostulation with God is an expression of faith. I would say, speaking as a pastor, that this is a healthy and vital expression of faith. The kind of faith which, in the spirit of Augustine, seeks understanding rather than standing pat on simplistic and dogmatic answers. It's a trait of human nature to want the simple answers, the packaged doctrines, the secure orthodoxy. And Job's friends, and perhaps even the great theologian Elihu, who took it upon himself to add his monologue to the discussion, are all too human in this respect. You who are pastors know that such orthodox faith, even simplistic faith, which gives blessed assurance, is what the people want. And Job found his theological counselors, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, to be poor pastoral counselors in a time of suffering. And I suspect that many people to whom we minister want a faith that can be honest to God. Indeed, there is something therapeutic, there is something healing in a faith which, as in the Psalms of Lament, dares to wrestle with God in time of distress. Second, the Old Testament expostulations of faith, all of them rest upon one grand conviction, and that is that the God who is worthy of our human adoration, the God who has chosen to give himself, his name, personally to a people, the God whose wonderful deeds are remembered and recited in the worshiping and believing community, is the faithful God. Here we do not find people shaking their fists at a cold and brassy heaven, or resigning themselves heroically to impersonal fate, but people who testify, even in times when they walk through the valley of dark shadow, that God is not capricious, God is not disinterested, but that God is faithful and concerned. To be sure, that conviction may at times weaken as we go through the ups and downs of our own existence, but we are not expressing this faith individually, but in a shared community, a believing and worshiping community, and the worship of this community is grounded in and motivated by this conviction expressed and exclaimed in Psalm 100, "For Yahweh is good. His chesed, his faithfulness endures forever, and his trustworthiness to all generations." That basic and unshakable premise of faith can release people of faith to expostulate with God, seeking to understand God's ways. And finally, these expostulations seem to move in one direction, into a deeper understanding of the problem of evil, and a correspondingly deeper understanding of the mysterious sovereignty of God over his creation. The prophetic understanding of evil was intended as a call to full human responsibility, rather than shifting the blame to a historical fate, to heredity, to environment, to the actions of historical ancestors, or to vast historical forces. The prophet Ezekiel met this problem, the problem of theodicy, forcefully with a word from Yahweh that called people to responsibility, to taking control of their own lives. Said Ezekiel, "Your people say, the way of Yahweh is not just, when it is their own way that is not just." This prophetic explanation, though it was partially right, was inadequate to cope with the full impact of historical tragedy. Evil has larger dimensions than can be encompassed in the doctrine of sin and deserved punishment, as we should surely know.